So a little bit about QGIve for those on this webinar who aren't familiar with QGIve. We are a fundraising software that provides fundraising services to over 6,000 organizations throughout the United States and Canada. We are really excited to offer features such as donation forms, peer-to-peer fundraising, text fundraising, events and auction managements, and we're really excited to assist you in your fundraising efforts. We are also really excited to refer our nonprofit friends to our amazing partner network, one of them being Marsherall Partners that we have today, a wonderful consulting service really specializing in data analysis and workflow inefficiencies. So we have Tricia with us today. She is the founder and president, and she is an expert on all things database management. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tricia and she can dive in.
Thanks so much, Wendy. I am thrilled to be here with you all today. And Wendy, if you wouldn't mind just enabling the share for me so that I can share my slides, but so thrilled to be with you. I am a self-proclaimed and very proud data nerd. So we will be digging into the data. We are going to let our nerd flags fly with that data. We are going to be talking down through prospect management fundamentals, some of the common roadblocks that I see with clients, and we work with clients across the country. So I have currently clients in 20 states, ranging in size from 100% volunteer run organizations to health systems that span multiple states with multiple foundation affiliates and everything in between. So really excited to dig into that. We've worked with organizations on setting up that prospect management for those who have just one staff member that's doing everything and trying to juggle a small portfolio as well, all the way up to large foundations with multiple gift officers who are carrying portfolios. We'll share some tips and tricks to leverage your database in order to help streamline and make those processes and the operations of that much more efficient for you. I will be doing a data challenge speed round. So if there are specific questions that you have that you're bringing to this presentation or that you're hoping to get out of this presentation to take back to your operations and your advancement offices, please, that is your time to ask those questions. I'll try and get through as many as I possibly can, but you'll put those in chat and Wendy will feed those to me. And then we're going to talk about some tools that you can take away today. And at the end, leave some additional time for Q&A if I don't answer all of those questions during the data challenge speed round. For those of you who joined my webinar last year, we did a data challenge speed round, and it was really interactive. And I think folks benefited from being able to hear some live examples happening at other organizations. So please have those questions prepared and we'll dig in. So we are going to start by talking down through those prospect management fundamentals. And in my experience, there are really few things as important to successful fundraising as clean data around your prospect portfolio management. I see it very often with organizations that we work with. One of the first things that is often shared with me is there's some mistrust of the data, whether it's in reports overall of fundraising reports, but especially as it relates to prospect management. And when you don't have that trust in your data, it really hinders your ability to build those gift officer pipelines, your donor pipeline management, your reports, and really making sure that you're reaching out to the right people at the right time with the best message. And so making sure that we are paying attention to that. It helps to create creating some standardization around that regarding your portfolio tracking, your donor interactions, documenting your proposals and next steps. It's really critical to the health and sustainability, quite frankly, of any fundraising program. So a couple of things that we want to make sure we touch on today. The first is what it looks like to define a solicitation strategy. So making sure that we are defining a plan within your database that aligns with your overall fundraising goals and your overall organizational strategic initiatives. So a lot of times the organizations that my team and I work with, there is some analysis done in terms of portfolio, or it's outreach to donors who gave at the same time last year, which is great. But you also want to make sure you're tying that strategy to the overall fundraising plan and the overall organizational strategy to make sure all of that is in alignment. Another benefit to making sure that you have an appropriate plan in place is strengthening those relationships with donors. So actually defining and documenting what that strategy looks like can strengthen that relationship with your donors. Oftentimes when, unfortunately, people move on to other positions or decide to leave the organization altogether, sometimes those next steps with the donors are not documented, or maybe they're documented outside of the database. And when that happens, it's difficult to know exactly where those relationships stand, and sometimes they can fall through the cracks. So making sure that we have that documented in a location that the entire team has access to is really important. Having a sound prospect management strategy in place can also help increase donor retention. So you are approaching it with advanced knowledge and really intentional, rather than being reactive to where your donors are in terms of their giving. So it helps you understand where each of your prospects or donors are in that donor life cycle. So are they in that identification, qualification, cultivation, solicitation, or stewardship phase? And what next steps need to happen in order to move them through that cycle? Next is increasing the efficiency of the office. So having some of those standardized and documented practices, it's difficult, I know, especially for the smaller shops, and especially at year end when everybody is so hyper focused on making gold, to take a step back and really standardize and document that practice. But I can tell you, with a number of the organizations that we work with, one of the first questions I ask is, how are you defining a major donor? And that answer, depending on who I'm talking with on the team, varies. And sometimes the answer is, well, we're really not sure. So creating some of those standardized practices can help increase efficiency with the gift officers and understand next steps very clearly with donors. You also can strengthen and create that transparency of communication. So documenting that moves management within your donor database helps those plans, allows you to review them regularly. You're not trying to pull the information from other areas outside of the donor database. And then also it should help increase your donor giving. So creating and executing a thought out and planned moves management plan with your donors really can help move those prospects through the pipeline and allow you to create those loyal donors who, hopefully, if you're starting with them at the leadership annual level, hopefully by creating that plan, you're moving them to become major and principal gift donors. So what are some of the common roadblocks? These are often items that I see frequently with our clients. So the first is a lack of strategy. And it's not that the fundraisers don't know what they're doing. Of course, they know what they're doing. They just don't really have the time to sit down and document it and plan it out. So understanding and really identifying what are those priorities and what are the long-term goals of the fundraising team. So the other thing that I see is sometimes there's multiple stakeholders that are reaching out to a constituent. And what could potentially happen, and I've seen it happen, is you are in the midst of a campaign and you are preparing to make a major gift request to a donor who has the capacity to give a large gift to your campaign. And perhaps there's an annual gift officer who is reaching out to that donor just for their annual gift. You want to make sure that you're coordinating those efforts. And unfortunately, I've seen instances where that's not the case, where somebody might be reaching out to give a $500 or $1,000 gift when you were intending within a few weeks to be making a much larger request. So making sure that there's a unified strategy, not just for the donor's sake, but for internal purposes, so that as an organization, you're reaching out with that longer term fundraising goal in mind. Missing information. So there is oftentimes data tracked outside of the database. That might be information that lives in Word documents or Excel spreadsheets where that pipeline for each of the donors is tracked. Next steps might be tracked there as well, or they may be in gift officer calendars with future meetings set up. It could be, I've seen many gift officers take handwritten notes on their donors, or I've seen it where the gift officers are so intimately familiar with their portfolio that it lives in their heads and it's not documented within a centralized location. And so when that happens, there are so many different areas where this information can be tracked. And when it's not in the database, it really prevents us from being able to show accurate reports, accurate next steps. It prevents us from being able to project any kind of pipeline, but also for budgetary purposes. We want to know what are those future outstanding requests that we anticipate making before year end, and what requests do we anticipate coming in Q1 or Q2 of next year. That helps with budgeting purposes. And when that information isn't tracked in the database or isn't centralized, unfortunately, it just creates greater opportunity for things to get missed. Another challenge is gift officers have too many people in their portfolio. When there's staff transitions, it can be that the gift officers have to take on additional folks in their portfolio as we're waiting to hire, or unfortunately, in many instances, the budget is not approved to be able to hire an additional person to make up for the team member that was just lost. And when there's that portfolio overload, it becomes difficult to track all of those actions in the database because you're just trying to swim and keep your head above water to get everything entered. But that, of course, creates some common challenges that we see in the database. Poor data integrity is another challenge that we see. Oftentimes, there is a number of different folks tracking information in the database. If you are lucky enough to have a database administrator at the organization, sometimes that position can turn over, and database administrators may have different ways in which they choose to track that information. I've seen clients who have gone through database conversions, and the data from one system gets imported and potentially imported into incorrect areas in the new system that you're working on. And so when you're seeing data challenges or information in the system that you're questioning whether is accurate, that can really cause some challenges, especially amongst gift officers, because they're not trusting what they're seeing, and therefore they aren't able to make strategic decisions based on that data. And so when that's happening, it's causing some real challenges from a reporting standpoint, from even a team morale standpoint, because you all have a common goal of raising funds for your organization. And when you have tools that are limiting your ability to do so when they should really be enhancing your ability to do so, it of course can cause some frustrations internally. Competing priorities. Again, nonprofits are being asked to do a lot with fewer resources. And so those competing priorities are if you're choosing between spending an hour doing donor outreach and meeting with a donor versus getting that data into the database, I think we all know which one is going to win out there. So making sure that we can create some streamlined processes to be able to make this as quick and efficient in as few clicks as possible to get that information back into your database is really key here. And then the accountability. This is one conversation that I often have with our clients. So defining what those metrics, those key performance indicators are. Some of the organizations that we work with look solely at, are we on target for budget? Did we make goal, the financial goal? But having those other metrics, such as how many meetings did we have with donors? What do our action items look like? What does the makeup of our portfolio look like? So do we have all of our prospects and donors currently in the solicitation stage? And then in Q1 and Q3, we really don't have anybody behind them in that pipeline, and therefore it's going to cause some challenges for us. So identifying what those metrics are, and I think sometimes it can be overwhelming for organizations, especially those who haven't practiced reporting out on metrics in that way. So really identifying a handful that are going to be important for the fundraising department, but also tie out to the overall organizational strategic plan to support those efforts, and looking at it really as a longer term investment. So for those of you who manage plan gift portfolios, you know that the work that you do 5 years ago can provide benefit 10 years out, right? So sometimes there's longer term metrics that you should be building toward, and taking a look at 1 or 2 and doing them well is much better than taking a look at 5 and really spreading yourself too thin to be able to accurately report on them and then have that accountability. So some of the tips to really leverage your database in order to support this. And I always take a step back here, because I think it's really important that you are looking holistically at the overall strategy. We can't implement from the database standpoint. I always say I can't really implement the database infrastructure and coding to support what these reports are going to be until we know what those priorities and those goals are. So you're going to want to define what your goals are and align your fundraising prospect management goals with your overall strategic plan. So looking at those long-term goals, your moves management structure may vary depending on that. So for example, if your organization is considering a capital campaign in the near future, are you also going to need to make sure that those annual giving donors are looked at separately, or are you doing a comprehensive campaign and it's all rolled up into one? Are your annual giving and sustainer donor programs a priority right now? And if so, how can your database infrastructure support what those programs and your goals are for those programs? What's your goals for donor retention? How about your upward movement in the donor pipeline? So it's great to see donors who are renewing each year, but have they increased their giving? Have they decreased their giving? And what are your goals for that? And then what are gift officer expectations? So do they have a certain number of visits that they need to meet in a year or in a month? If you know that your summer months are a little bit slower, what are you doing either in the spring or in the fall in order to make up for that? And how are you aligning your goals to account for the busy season and the slow season, respectively? So making sure that you're looking at that overall strategic plan and digging into how you can define what those goals are in order to achieve some of those metrics. Next is standardizing the procedures. And this is often put to the bottom of the pile, and I am intentionally asking that it get moved up and be reviewed actually at the beginning. So creating what those standardization those procedures look like, starting with defining what is your portfolio size, what's your target. So are your gift officers to handle or carry a portfolio between 100 and 125 prospects? Does that account for if they are not full-time gift officers and you have, for example, an executive director that has to do and wear many other hats? How does their portfolio size get adjusted for that? And if those are the target sizes, where do your portfolios currently stand? So documenting what that and defining what that portfolio size looks like for each of the positions within your department. I also say this type of analytics and defining it helps as you're building out what that budget looks like. And oftentimes, if you can get another gift officer position approved, it's through defining what this looks like and being able to show how many of your gift officers are currently over capacity and what the potential is for another portfolio. That's the fundraising team are one of the very few positions within an organization where the ROI is very high. For positions generally that are invested in, you see a higher return. So looking at what that size looks like, you might define what is considered a transformational, principal, major, or annual gift and frequency. So a lot of times organizations will define the major gift. And my next question is, okay, is it a one-time gift or is that a pledge? And if it's a pledge, if you're accepting that, what's the period of time that you'll accept that gift amount to be payable over time? And identifying what that looks like is really key. What are the gift officer roles? So clearly defining what your solicitor types are going to be, meaning what is a primary solicitor and what is a secondary solicitor, and what are their roles and responsibilities. So for some organizations that I work with, that primary solicitor is the sole person responsible for managing the overall fundraising approach and strategy with that donor. And any of the secondary solicitors are not able to reach out to that prospect or donor without coordinating those activities with the primary gift officer. And that is intentional, and it's meant to establish the collaboration amongst gift officers, but also make sure that you are aligning the priorities and approaching the donor with a unified approach and strategy. Defining the stages of moves management. So is there an expectation of time frame that a prospect or donor can remain within a specific stage, like cultivation or solicitation? And what does that look like? And what are the specific definitions of prospect statuses? How are you defining identification, cultivation, qualification, any of those statuses? What is considered a meaningful interaction? So clearly define what constitutes a meaningful visit. And of course, the pandemic taught us certainly that conversations can happen over Zoom and be meaningful, and moving that relationship or that donor to consider a next step. But is a meaningful interaction a bump in it at the grocery store where you just, you see the donor and you wave hello? Does that and should that get recorded? And so making sure that your office has decided what is considered a meaningful interaction, as well as how that's going to get recorded in your database. And then responsibilities: who's responsible for updating and maintaining the policies and protocols? And from an accountability standpoint, how are folks, what are the agreed upon metrics where we're going to be reporting and tracking towards those goals? Next is, once we move down through defining those goals and standardizing the procedures, now let's take a look at preparing your database. So things to consider: information storage. What and where does the information live, and what's recorded regarding your donors and your prospects? Is it stored in spreadsheets and notebooks? Is it in the heads of your gift officers? And how do we gather and get that information back into your database? What cleanup needs to be completed? So a lot of times, they say, well, I want to track this. Okay, great. We agree we need to track that information, but where does that data live currently? Where should it live in your database? And does information currently live in those database areas and codes that shouldn't live there? And so what realistically needs to be done to clean that up, and what's the time frame to get that cleaned up in order to leverage the appropriate codes within the database for this database, for the tracking of donors and prospects within your system? And are we storing it in a location that is optimal for gift officers? That is a key piece. You want to take a look at both sides from the database professional standpoint of, where does it make the most sense for this information to live for best reporting capabilities and being able to query and pull on that information? But from a gift officer standpoint, what's the easiest place where they can go in, they can see it, they can update it with as few clicks as possible? Because they really shouldn't be spending a large portion of their time on the administrative tasks of maintaining this. We want to make this as simple and easy as possible so that they can spend the majority of their time fundraising and performing that donor outreach. as you're looking at the tables, what fields are going to be impacted and what needs to be recoded, and how are you going to build out that moves management strategic plan within your database. The data mapping. So a lot of times for organizations that have tracked this inconsistently, and especially for gift officers who have tracked this information in spreadsheets outside of the database, sometimes what we do is actually take those spreadsheets and import them into the database. But in order to do that, you have to have some significant data mapping and prepare and plan for that kind of implementation. So how you can automate what those processes look like, and then making sure that you have appropriate checks on the back end once that information is added. So those data health checks are going to be really important to verify your data is coded correctly, verify whether there's any errors in data entry. We're all human, and you want to make sure that somebody is paying attention to that, because it can impact reporting, it can impact your KPIs, and proactively reviewing that data for common entry mistakes is really important for the health of the database, as well as the health of the moves management program and rebuilding that trust of your data integrity. Next, you're going to want to review those existing portfolios or assign new portfolios. So making sure that you're looking at your current gift officer portfolio size, composition, your donor capacity. Should people be moved out that have become stagnant in the portfolio? Do we have a strong pipeline of donors that we should be reaching out to? And for those organizations who have annual gift officers as well as major gift officers, what does that pipeline look like? Once you have your policies in place, your procedures in place, your data infrastructure is set, and you've created some examples that your gift officers can go by, you're going to want to provide that training. So you're going to want to invest in training each team member to make sure everybody is on the same page. And those should be one-on-one. So generally, I do this type of training both one-on-one as well in group settings. And so those one-on-one sessions, you should be doing screen design. So a lot of times, organizations that we work with, the gift officers actually don't have all the required and necessary fields that they need in order to see comprehensive information. And there's inconsistencies around what columns and fields, even across users within the organizations, have. So you want to make sure that every team member has a screen design session so that they all have a similar view of the constituent record set up within the database, any of your dashboards, making sure that they have all the same common columns and fields. You want to do this in a one-on-one session so they can share their screen, and you can make sure and coach them within those sessions. But you also want to have those one-on-one sessions so that they can ask questions that they may be uncomfortable to ask in the larger group. And then as you have these one-on-one sessions, you can identify some of the common questions to bring back to the larger group and have really thoughtful conversations around and making sure that everybody is trained in a similar manner. You'll create those procedures. A lot of organizations that we talk with, these procedures are created and then folks are not trained routinely on these. We set it up, we train once, and then we don't talk about it again. So coming back to these training materials, performing check-in 15-minute sessions just to make sure that any questions are answered, and then new employees who are being onboarded, making sure that you capture those screen design sessions, those one-on-one sessions with them, and train them appropriately. So those ongoing learning opportunities are really key. So you want to make sure that you are establishing a feedback loop. So you're going to want to regularly meet with your gift officers, see if there's anything that they're questioning, that they have concerns on, making sure that you have those monthly meetings for your gift officers to report on activity. That way we don't get to year end and there's crunch time and now we're being very reactive and trying to meet goal furiously, just pushing things through. So making sure that you're having those regular reviews of your portfolio are really key there. Regular review of your metrics, so establishing those metrics and key performance indicators early on, and then making sure that you are tracking progress toward goal. I think a lot of times KPIs at organizations have been used almost punitively. And this is really intended to empower gift officers and really everybody on the team to understand where we stand. I think a lot of times gift officers are they don't have that access to the data that they would really like to be able to see regularly. And so creating some of those dashboards where they can access it, they can see the information when it's updated in real time and are empowered to be able to make decisions based on that information. And then, of course, we talked about those data health checks. So looking at your database regularly to see if there's any statuses missing, prospect statuses or opportunity statuses or proposals. That information is key. So making sure that the data is full and complete, especially around actions or interactions within your database, because if data points are missed, it can, of course, impact reporting and cause, if certain fields aren't filled in, they could potentially be omitted. You could be understating or overstating your progress on your metrics. So you want to make sure you've got those regular routine checks. And so this really requires strong partnership between the database professionals and the gift officers, as well as the leaders within the organizations, because those leaders are really held accountable for the metrics and how it ties out to the organizational goals. The gift officers need this information in order to perform their roles efficiently. And of course, the database professionals need this information to get into the database. So with that, I am going to open it up for data challenge speed round. So I think there have been a couple of questions that have been asked in the chat already, but please go ahead and start asking your questions if you have questions specific to what statuses look like, what a database build out looks like, if there are challenges between gift officer requests and what you're able to provide, or if there are specific data challenges, please drop them in the chat now.
So thank you so much, Tricia. I'm so happy this is recorded because this is such wonderful information. We have Mark asking, what is a proper portfolio size for one person?
So Mark, that's a good question. It's really going to depend on the position. So for major gift officers, if they are exclusively focused on major gifts, generally it's between 100 and 125 prospects. I've seen organizations go smaller than that, and I've seen organizations go slightly larger than that. I really wouldn't recommend much larger than that, though. And you're going to want to make sure that you are looking at not just the portfolio size, but also given that portfolio size, what's the expectation around the number of visits and touch points throughout the year with that portfolio? If you're looking at an executive director that is balancing multiple different priorities, then we reduce that portfolio size. It might be 25, depending on the level of other tasks that executive director or CEO might have, and it may be 50 to 75 if a large portion of your role is important to focus on fundraising.
Awesome. Mark is also asking, how is a data health check done? Is it a software? Is it done manually?
So this is usually something that should be, it's not a software. It would be within your donor database. So generally a query or something can be established so that you're reviewing records regularly. So you wouldn't need to recreate this every single month. This should be a one-time setup and then just reviewed monthly based on the date parameter. So it might be any new actions that are entered, and just you have all the standard fields to review to make sure that there's no gaps in the data. It could be setting up dashboards to be able to take a look at any proposals that are set up in your database, and again, make sure there's no gaps in the data. So just triple checking those pieces. It generally is a pretty quick check, and that's where often the database professional might partner with the gift officer who entered the information.
Thank you, Tricia. I have Joel asking, how simple or complex should dashboards be for board members and executive leadership?
That's a really good question, Joel. And I think I'm going to give the classic "it depends" answer. But it depends on what priorities are the board members or executive leadership looking for. So generally, we don't want to get in the weeds on specific asks for every single individual unless we're at a fundraising or development committee meeting, for example, where we may be tracking that. In terms of board members, if you have a board member requirement of giving a certain dollar amount or helping to secure a certain dollar amount or introducing a certain number of relationships, we do like to set up another solicitor type. So we have the primary and secondary solicitors, of course, but then we have what we like to call key influencers. And that's generally reserved for non-fundraising, non-development staff. That could be board members, it could be the CEO of the organization, but those are key influencers, and we like to be able to track those relationships with those existing board members. So I often like to, yes, include information on how many perhaps solicitations or what our overall fundraising goal is or where our donor pipeline stands, but also taking a look at who have board members introduced to us or who have they helped secure funding from, and be able to report that information as well.
Awesome. All right. This is our last question. So if anyone has any more, please drop it in the chat. But Linda is asking, data is in an Excel spreadsheet, but we have a robust CRM system. Do you have suggestions for migrating off of spreadsheets?
That is some of my favorite tasks to do. And again, the data nerd in me is coming out. This information or this type of project just lights up my day. I love doing this type of work. So yes, we have some recommendations on that. So take a look at your CRM system. And I'm not sure, Linda, which CRM tool you use. But making sure that you are mapping the information and that spreadsheet is full and complete. So a lot of times the information that's in spreadsheets, very rarely is it very systemized in terms of mapping directly to columns in your database. So there's a lot of cleanup of those spreadsheets that need to happen. If there is a lot of data over a long period of time, I would say start with maybe the most recent or start with the last year of data or information and work on getting that in first and then move backwards from there. But those actions should be, certainly if you have actions and next steps, that needs to be in there. If you have notes on the donor, this is another key piece. So if you have notes or information that is beneficial for anybody to know about the donor, that should be in a bio summary section or a note section on that donor record. It should not be buried in a specific action or meeting item where you may have learned that information. It can live in both, but if there's something that should be pulled out that should live in the overall donor record, make sure you're setting up your spreadsheet to be able to do that.
All right, we got a few more coming in. So Jim is asking, how do contacts move from suspects to qualified prospects to donors to major gift suspects, prospects, and donors?
Jim, also a really helpful question. I think understanding first who those donors are. So if I take a look at your question from each section of the proposal or the prospect pipeline stage. So if we have been given a name, for example, from a board member, we think that they are a qualified, maybe they have the capacity. So in order to determine whether they're qualified, you might do a little bit of outreach, or you may do a well screening on them. You're going to dig in your database or in your files to determine, do they have an existing relationship with us? If not, can we bring them in? Do their interests align? So then looking at, are we converting them to donors? I think, what are those touch points ahead of time? So are you asking the board member to have a sit down meeting or coffee with this prospective donor? What's the best approach for them to get them engaged? Are you just simply asking them to volunteer? And are you bringing them in to the organization that way? Are you asking them to come in for a tour? So what are those next steps to move them to become a donor? Hopefully that's the outcome that they consider. And then once you have that information, once you've really started to build that relationship with the donor, the next step then is making sure that you're aligning the donor's interest with a unique need for the organization and making sure that need aligns with the overall organizational strategy and as well as the fundraising strategy. Oftentimes I see organizations, especially those schools, for example, are quick to establish restricted scholarships, for example, or restricted funds. You want to make sure that if that is a priority, great, but you don't want to just stop at looking at that as an option. Perhaps you can make this a more unrestricted gift and align unique needs of the organization with the donor's interest.
Awesome. All right, we keep getting these questions. I guess we'll keep going with them. So we have commingled program context in our CRM with donors for output for newsletters, annual reports, invitations, etc. Do you recommend separating them out so we have a true donor CRM? Program staff do not have any interface to update the program contacts. Sad face.
So, Patty, I do love that you have the ability to track who your donors are versus sometimes who those people are that are interested in your program. So I think it's important to keep them within the same CRM. Of course, though, if you're trying to, I'm not sure what your programmatic needs are. So if your solution is not able to track, if your CRM solution is not able to track all programmatic needs as well as donor prospect needs in one solution, you may consider establishing another database to track some of those needs. But before I would recommend that course of action, of course, I'd want to take a look at your data. But generally speaking, if you have that information located in one database, that's to your benefit. And if you plan to communicate and reach out to them, I think it's certainly easier to do that if you're using one CRM versus multiple.
Awesome. I love this question from Stacy. She asks, we can never rely on the integrity of the reports we run off of our CRM because there are so many footnotes about each donation that are not captured in the CRM. There are so many unique anomalies about each donation. Is this fairly common?
Stacy, I think it's a common challenge, but I don't think it has to be a continued point of frustration or challenge. So generally, you want to code your CRM for the 90 to 95% of your gifts. There will be some that need to, you have to track specific information, or there will be some anomalies, but I have worked with organizations that have fewer than 1,000 records in their database, and I have worked with organizations that have over 500,000 records in their database. I have yet to come across a system where we can't establish generally coding that works for all gifts and accounts for some of these data challenges or data points that the perhaps gift officers would like to be able to capture or senior leadership wants to be able to capture. Sometimes there are some gifts that we need to look at on a one-off basis, but I have yet to be able to establish something that works for the majority of the database. So if you're talking about some of the unique anomalies in terms of funds, one of the pain points that I see there is often the advancement team is needing to track information like pledges, perhaps that finance is unable to book for whatever that reason might be. So sometimes there are anomalies in that way, or funds are not aligned, or reconciliation with finance is not performed at the end of the month. So those anomalies show up very loud and clear in some of those reports. So certainly would be happy to chat with you further about your specific scenario.
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia. And thank you everyone for those great questions. Did we just get one more?
No, I'm going to jump back in, Wendy. I
Okay.
was just chatting with Jim. Jim made a comment about Donor Perfect not having integrated solutions. And just wanted to make it clear to anyone and everyone who's on the line that QGIve is an integrated partner with DonorPerfect. All of our data flows seamlessly into the DonorPerfect CRM, and to some of Tricia's points from the previous conversation we've been going through, a lot of that can be mapped very specifically to the data points that you want to transfer over. So anything you're collecting on the QGIve forms can easily be transferred over into DonorPerfect and Bloomerang for Mark's purposes there.
Yeah,
You can. I'll send a link in the chat so that you guys can see all of our integrations as well.
yeah, and DonorPerfect, I am also a preferred partner with DonorPerfect, and I know that there are prospect management capabilities there, and I do know it directly integrates with email platforms, financial software, and accounting platforms. There's many different integrations for DonorPerfect, Jim. But in terms of prospect management, there's ability and capacity to be able to track this information within DonorPerfect.
Okay, it looks like that might be all of our questions, Tricia.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That's always it's always fun. I always enjoy doing that data challenge. Jack, I saw you just popped on. Did you want to add something there?
No, I just wanted to, if we were about to say goodbye to everybody else, I wanted to say goodbye as well. That's all.
I think I had just a couple more slides here, so I will jump right into them if that works. So some tools that hopefully you can take away and use right away today. So creating some of those standard definitions. What do you consider a major gift? What do you consider a substantive action in terms of, is it meeting face-to-face with a donor? Is a Zoom meeting sufficient? Is text or email? I know some of our gift officers that I've worked with have made strong arguments for why it should be considered substantive that I've agreed with in many instances. What are your definitions around your prospect status or your classifications? Who do you consider? How are you defining annual donor prospects or givers? How are you defining plan giving prospects? What are you doing with your event donors? Do you have donors or companies who are only ever going to be event sponsors and are not going to give outside of those events? And what does that look like? The other piece to consider is what happens. So for example, organizations that I give to, sometimes I give through my company, sometimes I give personally. So how are you tracking that, and how are you making sure that me personally is not showing up in one gift officer's portfolio and my company is showing up in another? So we usually create a code to be able to show that both myself and the company are accounted for with one gift officer. Again, those fundraiser types. So how are you defining who and what a primary solicitor is and what their roles and responsibilities are with that donor, and coordinating that strategy with the organization? How does the secondary fundraiser support that? How does the key influencer, so those board members or those folks who are non-fundraising staff, support that overall strategy? And then of course your former solicitors. We never want to just delete a staff member who may not be with the organization. We want to make sure that we're tracking that former solicitor so we know who that relationship has, who has held that relationship in the past. That might give us some context and how we may need to engage or re-engage with that donor. Again, those portfolios. So what's your portfolio size? What's the recent giving analysis? So have they given recently? Has that gift increased, decreased? What are the capacity of your gift officers in terms of adding additional portfolio? And what is the capacity of the specific donors within your portfolio? Have you done some sort of well screen to make sure that they are appropriately tracked in your database? And aside from just the well screening, what is their existing relationship with the organization or past relationship with the organization? Have they been a volunteer? Have they had children who have attended your school? Have they been a patient, and are they a grateful patient potentially? So what is not just their capacity from a well screening standpoint, but what is their inclination and interest in supporting the organization? Looking at that portfolio composition. So how many prospects, or what's the percentage of prospects in each stage at any given time? Understanding what that breakdown looks like is going to be really key. and looking at your database. So from the database administrator standpoint, where is all of that information currently tracked? How do you gather it and then make sense of it and identify where it should be mapped to and live within the database? Determine any of those missing data and threats to your data integrity. So are your gift officers entering everything? Can you create some standardization in required fields so that they're unable to save an action without filling in all of those fields? And can you create any forms or cheat sheets for them to be able to follow when they're updating that information? What needs to be restructured or recoded in your database, and how are you able to develop a plan for that cleanup? Have you established what those data health checks should be and what you should be reviewing and who's responsible for reviewing that information? And if you identify any information needs to be updated, who should be updating that? Your dashboards, identifying what you'd like to be able to track and setting that up, and of course, those mandatory fields. So those are a couple of the key takeaways. I know we've covered quite a bit in our presentation. So if there's any additional questions, please feel free to jump in chat there.
Yes, let's give it a minute or two in case there's any final questions from our attendees today. But I want to take some time to thank you so much, Tricia. This was
Pleasure.
Incredible. A good database and good data is the foundation to successful fundraising. So thank you so much for sharing this incredible information with us. And thank you to all the attendees for taking some time out of their schedule at year end to attend and learn with us and engage with us. We really loved all of your questions. I just want to send you a reminder to attendees, when you leave this webinar, there will be a very short survey for you to respond to. Please do. It helps us guide content for next year. So we love your input. Brendan and Jack, do you have anything you guys want to add or before we sign off?
Just a quick thank you for Tricia and the wonderful content you just shared with the audience and us. I always learn so much from our partners, so we appreciate it, and thank you all for attending today.
Yes, thank you all very much. And thank you, Tricia. It was a fantastic webinar.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And for anybody on, I did this last year, and but for anybody that would like to reach out, I'm certainly happy to do a session at no charge to review any of your specific questions. So that is, I gifted that last year and certainly happy to make that available again this year. So
Awesome.
That was great.
Awesome. The season of giving. Oh, it looks like we did get one question, if I can sneak it in.
Sure, yeah.
All right. Tyler asks, in regards to data, what is the top 5 things or categories that are important to have when it comes to strategizing data?
Oh, that's a really good question, Tyler. So top 5 things, and if we're looking overall at your data or just specific to prospect management, I think the first is looking at your gift coding. So many of the organizations that I work with, depending on the fields, there's always some sort of structure of campaign, fund, or general ledger, depending on what it's called in your system, appeal or solicitation, depending on what it's called in your system, and sub-solicitation or package, again, depending on the name of the code in your database. I often find that those fields are used incorrectly and inconsistently in your data. And those codes and the way in which information is tracked in your gift coding, it prevents any of your dashboards from being able to be accurate, and is the root of a lot of the data integrity concerns and mistrust of your donor database. I think also your solicitation codes. So for those of you who work at hospital systems, for example, sometimes donors or prospects at the point of treatment opt out from wishing to receive communications, those solicit codes. I've seen that data tracked in countless areas in your database. And if you are not careful with that information, you could potentially be fined. You want to make sure that you've established what those solicit codes should be, or the donor preferences for how they wish and when they wish to be communicated, or if they wish for you to remove them from the mailing list. That really should be tracked. That's key. Of course, in your donor prospect management, you want to make sure your solicitor types are tracked, and you want to make sure that you've got prospect statuses as well as proposal or opportunity statuses that are in there. So I'd say those are kind of the top areas that I would recommend reviewing and tracking. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia, for sliding that question in right at the end. That was a great way to end it. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Tricia. Thank you, Brendan and Jack.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Tricia, I think you'll have to end it because you're the host.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, with the
Thanks, buddy.